First of all, I would like to thank very much for the invitation, Chris. Well, in my view, one of the main achievements in this field, in the field of survival research, was the identification of certain individuals who report experiences that cannot be easily explained in terms of known confounds, such as fraud, expectancy, or suggestion, effects, code reading, or even symptoms of mental disorders, hallucinations, etc. Um, this applies to almost all phenomena relevant to the survival hypothesis, from mental and physical mediumship to near-death experiences, apparitional experiences, and so on. In the best cases, the evidence is such that it's difficult to reduce the observed phenomena or experiences to normal processes. And we are forced, in many of these cases, to at least entertain the possibility of survival, even if we are not totally sure of the existence of survival. But in the best cases, we are at least forced to consider this possibility. So this is the main achievement, I think. Still regarding the successes, I think researchers in this field were also able to separate, many times they were able to separate fact from fiction, to identify and expose cases of fraud or malingering, while recognizing that in some situations it was not possible to rule out a supernormal explanation. I like this term, supernormal. It was used by Myers. It was developed by Frederick Myers. Although the skeptics can always question, and they always do this, can always question the veracity of such cases or the reliability of the evidence, I tend to think that their criticisms are based sometimes more on speculation or retrospective analysis of what happened rather than on direct experience. For example, many criticisms made to phenomena observed in the presence of Eusapia Palladino or Daniel Douglas Home ignore the conditions in which this phenomena took place, the controls and precautions employed by the investigators, and even the repeated observations made before they could reach a conclusion. So I'm not saying that all the criticisms or all the comments made by skeptics are flawed, but the evidence is robust enough to warrant further investigation, further study. So I would say that still today there is much ignorance in academia and the scientific establishment regarding the evidence, not only evidence relevant for survival, but for psi phenomena in general. And this situation is not just the result of mistakes or errors made by survival research. This is also researchers. This is also a consequence of irrational prejudice over the topic. It would be erroneous to put all the responsibility, I think, in the hands of survival researchers. On the other hand, I don't think we have enough evidence at present to really demonstrate survival. So one thing is the phenomenon. We have evidence that something strange or unusual or anomalous occurs. But another thing is the demonstration of survival after death. In my view, there is still a long way before we can demonstrate survival. This happens mainly for two reasons. First, there is the fact that some aspects of survival are difficult to investigate empirically. For example, the alleged existence of a spiritual world where the spirits of the deceased go after death, etc. Actually, if survival does exist, we still don't know exactly how it occurs, what happens with our souls after death, the exact circumstances or processes underwent by consciousness after death, whether, for example, other animals survive death, whether reincarnation does exist. There's still some discussion, or at least there was some discussion in the past, this heated debate regarding whether reincarnation is genuine or not. I remember, for example, some discussion about this between Allan Kardec in France and Daniel Douglas Home. Daniel Douglas Home saying that, well, reincarnation is not possible, etc. In his book Lights and Shadows of Spiritualism. So, is reincarnation real? Is reincarnation possible? We have all this tradition in parapsychology that was developed, that was initiated by Ian Stevenson and is continued today by many others. So we need to form a coherent theoretical perspective of what survival is. So what are the exact conditions for the communication of deceased person through a medium? For how many years after death, for example, this communication is possible, and etc. There are many questions. So spiritualism and other spiritual or religious traditions, in Brazil we have different religions in which mediumship can be practiced, in which communication with deceased persons or spiritual entities can be practiced by mediums. These traditions all have many explanations for what happens after we die. There are many interesting descriptions of the afterlife in the literature. I remember a book that was published by the Italian psychical researcher Ernesto Bozano, in which he compiled many interesting descriptions of the afterlife. But how can we examine these descriptions empirically? Some of these descriptions might make much sense from a spiritualist or even from a philosophical or conceptual perspective, but it might take some time before we can demonstrate them empirically, that is, using the scientific method and more importantly, reconciling that knowledge with the knowledge already provided by physics, biology, the mainstream sciences. So the main mistake of some survival researchers, in my opinion, is to take for granted the existence of survival. It is to believe that the evidence available is enough, while ignoring that many questions remain to be answered. And these are not secondary questions. They are fundamental in my view. They cannot be easily postponed. We need to develop a more coherent theoretical perspective of what survival is, of what are the limits and conditions for survival, and more importantly, how can we test each assumption empirically, scientifically, develop ways to test these assumptions empirically. This is the first problem, and I have recently discussed this problem in more detail in a paper I have published in the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies. I can share the paper with you after our meeting. But a second problem I see is that we need to improve our dialogue with researchers from other fields and also with society at large. It would be of little benefit, of little practical importance to convince ourselves that survival is real if we cannot also convince other academics and the wider society. But maybe we can go back to this issue later when you ask me the third question, because it has more to do with this topic. First of all, there is the separation or division between proof-oriented research and process-oriented research in parapsychology. I think sometimes this division is problematic because it's not always possible, in my view, to rigidly separate the two. We need to ask ourselves what kind of survival we are talking about. Does our consciousness survive for only a few days, weeks, or months? Does it preserve personal memories, feelings, and thoughts? Is the surviving personality only a simulacrum, or the real me, the real Everton? Um, um, Theosophists, for example, they say that exists. They talk about the astral shells. So it's a kind of remnant of the dead. So it's similar to the deceased person, but it's not the same thing. And sometimes they say that these astral shells could communicate through mediums and etc. Is it possible to have these astral shells? Are they really are they genuine in some way? So um, you see that there are many questions that we need to answer. The fact that our consciousness cannot be reduced to brain activity does not immediately translate into evidence of survival. To demonstrate survival, we should be able to show that this consciousness keeps existing in some way after death and is able to communicate through a medium, operational experience, and so on. When parapsychologists talk about survival, they are usually implying personal survival, not other form of survival. But there other forms of survival? We don't know the answer to that yet. Do survival processes differ for each person? For example, is it possible that someone has a different survival process in comparison to other person? And what are the factors that influence this difference? You see, the answers to these questions are essential to the problem of survival, and we cannot simply postpone them. We cannot simply ignore them as challenges for the future. We need to answer them if we want to establish a clearer picture, a clear understanding of what survival is. So, in other words, there is still a long way, in my view, before we can understand survival, at least from a scientific perspective. The spiritual traditions might already know or have some knowledge about how survival occurs, but science is still progressing in this particular. Well, the collaboration with spiritual practitioners, mediums, spiritualists is mostly desirable. I think there was a time when mediums would be seen as only as subjects, and their ideas or contributions would not be necessarily considered in the design of the experiment of this or scientific project. I tend to think that this situation significantly changed over time, and today there is much recognition, much more recognition of the importance of listening to what mediums have to say about their own experiences and to consider this knowledge from the beginning in the development of scientific study. One of the many problems I see in parapsychological research today is that some experiments may lack sufficient ecological validity. Things have improved over time, but this is still a problem, not only in parapsychology. I think that in many other sciences, human sciences in general. But what is ecological validity? It is when your experiments adequately reproduce the necessary conditions for the phenomena to occur. An experiment is always something artificial, in more or less artificial. It is not the same thing as observing a phenomenon as it takes place in its cultural environment or condition. An experiment is always a selection of certain aspects of reality, but you may lose important information in that process of selection. So with an experiment, we reach a more reliable conclusion. We can predict things more clearly and even ascertain causality, this cause and effect relationship. But we may also lose contact with the phenomenon, the experiencer. we may distance ourselves from the phenomenon in an attempt to systematize things, to rationalize and submit to scientific investigation. So when we ask for the collaboration of mediums and spiritualists, this is important because we might be able to develop experiments that more clearly reproduce the conditions that are needed to the phenomena or experiences to occur. And then we can document the phenomena, we can analyze them, subject them to the scientific scrutiny. I know some researchers who are also experiencers, researchers who are mediums or psychics, and this is great. I don't see any necessary problem or conflict with this. It depends on how you do it. Some people might fear that if they are members of a specific group or they believe in the reality of the phenomena, they will not be able to be more impartial, to hold a more impartial perspective toward their object of study. But I don't think so. I don't think it is important. I do think it is important to listen to what the experiences have to say. It's important also to learn to distance yourself from the topic and develop a more scientific approach. But this would be required of almost anyone, of a skeptic also, and even someone who is not a member of that specific group or religion or philosophy, etc. I'm a professor of religious studies at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo in Brazil. And many of my students and even colleagues are religious believers, are religious practitioners, and they are able to develop amazing research projects despite their involvement with their traditions. So in a certain way, I tend to think that it is good to have some involvement because things become easier. It is easier to access documents, to access people for interviews, and etc. Because you know the place, you know the people, you know how to approach people for data collection, and etc. You know the language. So I think it has some benefits to have some involvement. A person from outside this tradition or group or philosophy would have to learn everything from the beginning, from the start. I was raised in a spiritualist family, and my mother is a medium, is a spiritualist medium. So I learned to respect her experiences. I learned to understand this phenomena through her experiences and my involvement with her. And I think it's very important to take this view into consideration. I even carried out a study with some of my students on an autoethnographic approach to the study of mediumship, when the researcher relies on his or her own experience to understand the phenomena. And it was very interesting. Some of my students are mediums, and they were able to describe their own experiences in the paper. And some others are not mediums, but they had the opportunity to use ayahuasca, which is an entheogen, a substance that is used in some mediumistic rituals in Brazil. And they had very similar experiences to those reported by mediums in a more spontaneous way. It was very interesting because their experiences using ayahuasca were very similar to the experiences, phenomenologically similar to the experiences that were reported by are reported by mediums without the use of this substance. So this started we started a whole discussion about this, about possible neurochemical processes involved in spontaneous mediumship and in experiences promoted by the use of certain substances. So I think that this ethnographic and autoethnographic approach is is very interesting. So I do believe in the importance of collaborating with spiritualists and mediums. On the other hand, there are some challenges to consider in such a collaboration. I think that some spiritual explanations may be hard to examine empirically or may require a long process of scientific developments in other fields, physics, technology, etc., before being significantly established. For example, the existence of another dimension or spiritual world. To demonstrate this other world, we will need more than the experiences of mediums or people who came close to death and reported an NDE, for example. We also need to demonstrate this other world empirically. And how can we do this? Do we already have the technology for this? So this is a collaboration, I think, that needs much patience from both sides. The scientists on one side must recognize that the mediums are human beings, that they have their own limitations, that they don't know everything about their own experiences, and they are also trying to learn more about them. They are also trying to figure out what's happening with them in many respects. On the other side, the mediums must understand that science has its own rules, that some degree of skepticism and doubt is important in science, and that experimental controls and conditions are necessary if we want to investigate this phenomena scientifically. We have to be patient and be able to persevere on our goals despite the challenges on the way. So, but I think it's not only possible, but it's fundamental to have this collaboration. Yeah, well, it's an exercise in precognition or or something like that. Well, in an ideal situation, the problems I have mentioned before would be solved and survival would be demonstrated scientifically and recognized by the wider public as real. This is what we expect or what we desire. But there are some challenges we need to take into account before all that. We tend to think that if survival could be demonstrated, then people would accept it favorably because it could provide great comfort and strength, especially to those in grief, those facing bereavement. However, we usually neglect other possible cultural consequences. For example, there are some conservative Christians who may deny the validity of the evidence for survival on the ground that it contradicts their faith, that conflicts with their faith. Members of spiritual traditions, denominations, and cultures, other cultures for which communication with the dead is considered impossible or even prohibited in some way, they may also question the evidence for survival or the way we interpret the evidence. So as research on survival progresses, I think that survivalists will have to deal not only with academic orthodoxy and skepticism, scientific establishment, but also with religious and cultural confrontation. This is something that is not very much discussed. I think that the emphasis is put much more on the methodological or experimental aspects, but there are important cultural aspects to consider. How to respond to that kind of cultural or religious confrontation. This is one big challenge I think we'll have to consider. If survival research progresses in the direction of really demonstrating the existence of survival. Also, I think that another important challenge is the development of certain neuroscience and artificial intelligence technologies. Things such as telepathy and clairvoyance will tend to be more and more disregarded over time, I think, because people will turn to other means of communication, including perhaps sophisticated brain-to-brain communication. There are laboratories investigating this, and this will become a reality in the future. So no need to use psi to communicate at distance. Why we need to use psi if this technology becomes available? It is the same thing with cell phones, with computers, with our Zoom meeting right now. So no need of psi. Recently, I also heard about the possibility of using artificial intelligence in the future to simulate a deceased individual's personality. This is crazy. So the artificial intelligence will basically emulate the dead. Although I do not believe that this will necessarily extinguish mediumship, mediumship will remain as important to many people. This fake AI messages will probably add to these already unfavorable future perspectives, I think. So this is, in my view, a big cultural, sociocultural challenge that we will have to face in the future. So I sometimes think that the moment to make the great leap in survival research is now. We cannot wait much longer for this. We need to keep with this research and improve our methodology and discussion. So in this sense, it is interesting to see the efforts made by people like Robert Bigelow and others to help advance the field. It's interesting to see that survival is regaining interest from parapsychologists after many years of focus on other phenomena that were not necessarily relevant to the survival hypothesis. So it's regaining interest, and it's interesting to see this change. On the other hand, Frederick Myers used to say that these abilities, such as telepathy and even mediumship, are not to be used in this world. He had this very interesting idea that these are spiritual abilities or faculties. So Myers believed that these faculties are not subjected to biological evolution in the same way as other human abilities. If this is so, then the problem is solved, because we don't need to worry about how technology is impacting research on survival, etc. Most parapsychologists wouldn't agree with Myers. They would certainly prefer more biological and physical explanations of psi, because their explanations help them establish links with other scientific fields, with biology, with physics, etc., with evolutionary psychology, cognitive sciences. But maybe Myers was right, and what we have are only glimpses of this other world, another world. These abilities are not to be used during this life, according to Myers, but in the next world. It's a very interesting idea, I think, and helps explain many things. For example, the elusiveness of psi. Why these phenomena are so elusive, why it is so difficult sometimes to investigate and replicate these findings. Myers' notion may provide an explanation. It's a very metaphysical conception, but very, very interesting. So these are, I think that these are the challenges we have to face. These are not only epistemological or methodological challenges, but also cultural and broader philosophical challenges to consider.